I like this picture. I'm going to talk a bit more about this picture in a minute, but the title of the talk is ExperienceOps. I couldn't really decide whether to call it ExOps or ProdOps. You know, it's something to do with like DevOps and user experience and product management and DevOps. And I think in the end I decided it was too late, that neither of those was a good answer. Both of those are pretty terrible words, but that's kind of, well, we'll get into it a bit more later, and hopefully I'll explain a bit more about it. I'm a bit nervous, actually. Normally when I've spoken before, but not in front of my colleagues. And I have to work with most of you tomorrow, it seems like. Seems like half of HMRC's in here. So that's slightly awkward. And for the people who don't work at HMRC, I think I've worked with a lot of you as well. So hello, again, I've not met a telehead, great, how you doing? So I work at HMRC at the moment, and usually I do UX stuff. The last couple of roles I've had have not been UX, though, so I'm one of the people that Thomas was talking about who've done a few different roles, and that is one of the opportunities I've taken. I kind of do a sort of product-ish role at HMRC at the minute, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment, I think. But first I want to talk about my friend Christina's toilet. She studied architecture when this is about 20 years ago when we were at college. We shared a house together, and she studied architecture, and she was really interested in space and stuff like that. And she had a toilet that she painted purple. And it was weird, because when you sat in that toilet, you actually couldn't be in that space anymore. It felt like you were floating. So you go in there, and it'd just be, if you went in there, you couldn't actually be in it. It just felt like you were in this strange, really weird space. So she did all those kind of things. And she also did this as well. She kind of made a window out of lard. This is lard, by the way. That's what lard looks like before it's turned into a packet stuff. So she made this kind of window thing, and it had, imagine 2 panes of glass, and in the middle of this pane of glass was all this lard stuff. And it was her part of her final architecture student project, and it was supposed to be like a smart material, because when it got hot, lard melts and becomes translucent, and it lets the light through. And so anyway, she did all of these really cool things, and she had I remember she had a party at her house in the garden in October once, and she made rooms out of light. And it was freezing, but at the same time, she'd made it light so it felt like it was warm. And so she did all of these really cool things. And I don't know, at the time, I sort of thought this was a really exciting life that she was getting into. I remember meeting her a couple of years after that in a pub, and she was sort of talking about what she was doing, and she'd become an architect. And she was just one of the most disappointed people I've ever met in my life. Because I asked her what she'd been doing, and what she'd been doing was designing disabled toilets for art centres. And she'd done that for nearly 18 months, actually. She'd sort of, in the architecture practice that she was in, she'd kind of been given the job of designing the disabled toilets. And she was kind of really quite crestfallen by this. And I think at the time, I also thought this was a terrible situation for her to be in, to have this dream of designing these amazing sort of cathedral-like buildings, and then you're doing disabled toilets. Now I'm a lot older than that, and I think, let's pretend for a moment that I do go to parties and I get invited to these things, but if I did go to parties, I'm pretty sure that I would be the one talking in the kitchen to the person who designs disabled toilets. It's a genuinely interesting, noble thing to do. But when you're 20, you don't really see that. You see, it's not the glamorous thing. I've got a friend who's got this test. He calls it the Hey Dad test. So this is a picture I took on Sunday, actually. And can you guess what my daughter's actually saying? She's saying, "Hey Dad." Can you guess? So she's just ridden a bike for the first time. And so she's saying, "Hey Dad, look at me, I've ridden a bike." And this kind of test that my friend has is this kind of thing where you sort of say, when you have to describe your job to somebody, if you can say, "Hey Dad, I did this," then you're doing really well. I don't think I can say, "Hey Dad." Like today, I was trying to think with our team what we're working on today, and it was refactoring this, moving something out of a microservice into another microservice. It's very hard for me to say, "Hey Dad, I did that today." Obviously, if you're a developer, it's really easy to pass the Hey Dad test, because you're always doing these really super cool bits of work. There you go. There's all the developers at work again. Not at all so easy for my particular specialism then, so UX. This is a diagram of what UX is drawn by, actually somebody pretty cool, in fact. I think it's probably the best thing you can say about this diagram is you could probably change all of the words and it wouldn't really make any difference to how you understand it. But the ideas here is kind of sound, right? There's lots of things that go into user experience. And I think there's things missing, weirdly enough. There's probably, particularly with, accessibility is missing there. We've got human factors. I mean, I'm a kind of information architect, human factors and a bit of content. That's the kind of stuff that I'm probably good at. I do a bit of interaction design as well, because that's what you have to do. But that's the kind of mess, I think, that UX is in. And I think this is also a fair reflection of what employers think UX is. Right? So pretty much, when you go to a place and they are looking for a UX person, you don't really have an idea of what they're expecting or what they want. I'm not sure this is a coherent field in lots and lots of ways. But that's... The fact that I'm not really saying that UX is incoherent, though. I'm actually saying something slightly different. So I don't know if you've ever seen this one before. This is an example of a Gestalt shift. So UX people are kind of obsessed with Gestalt, laws of Gestalt and all that kind of stuff. But the interesting character is that one in the middle. It's not that it's incoherent. There's a term for this. It's multi-stable. So it has 2 points of stability. It can either be a 13 or it can be a beat. And the idea is that none of you can see both of those, right? You can't see both of those at the same time. You can see one of them, but not both, not at the same time. Can anybody think they can see both? Because if you can, you're a vampire or something like that. There's another one. There's another example. Which way do you see the stairs? Are they going down? Or there's all that kind of... This one's a really famous one as well. Some of you are seeing the dancer move clockwise, and some of you are seeing the dancer move anti-clockwise, and I have no way of knowing there, because it's multi-stable. There's something going on there. This one's another example. Some of you are seeing it go one way, and some of you see it go another way. This one's, I really like this one, because this really illustrates what's going on here. In UX, or these kind of laws of Gestalt, you talk about the figure in the ground. The figure's the stuff in the foreground, and the ground is the stuff, obviously, in the background. And here we see something that's playing around. The figure in the ground is kind of moving around and stuff. You can probably make this happen. I can teach you how to do this one. So if you look at that space, and then blink, and then look at that space over there, you should be able to make them change direction. Can you do that? And obviously, it's the same image, no change there. And again, it's multi-stable. It's got 2 different stability points. And there's obviously the most famous one there. Is it a duck? Is it a rabbit? Is it both? Probably not both, again, unless you're a vampire. This is the Necker cube. So the Necker cube is kind of one of the early sort of named shapes of this. And again, from a textbook on that, you should be able to see is the cube sort of is at the top or the bottom, all that kind of stuff. And the bit I want to focus on then is that there's a science fiction novel that I've not read. I'm not going to read it. It's got a terrible cover. But one of the ideas in this book is that people talk about neckering. And the idea of neckering is that you can sort of focus on 2 different aspects. Not at the same time, because that's not possible, but you focus on 2 different aspects very rapidly, and that enables you to develop a new kind of understanding. You can understand things in a different way. And in my head, I kind of think of this like an engine, that you've got these kind of pistons going up and down. As you change your perspective, you can move yourself along. Incidentally, what kind of engine is this? Wankel. It's a Wankel engine, which I don't know why I chose that name. Something just spoke to me, I guess. So I think, I'm not saying that UX is unique in this respect. Right? I think all of the roles in these delivery teams, we have kind of 2 different perspectives. You see the big picture, and you see the big picture and the small picture and the big picture and the small picture. But I think probably maybe UX has more of this than other roles, because you're always looking at things at different scales to other people. Obviously, when you're working, well, we'll have some examples of that in a second. So I think the idea of this kind of like Necker stuff, the ability to change perspectives, I think it's very hard to do at will. Like, it's not something that we naturally do. Like, if you look at that picture of the train going down the tunnel, very few of you went, I wonder if I close my eyes, it's going to come the other way. It's not something that comes naturally to us. When we see the duck or the rabbit, probably most people just see one of them, the duck. And then later on, when somebody points out it's also a rabbit, they kind of notice that. We don't naturally fall into these things where we see both sides. And I see this all the time. So this is actually, I've anonymized this, but this is a whiteboard from this week, actually, at work. I love these conversations that I have, particularly with architects. I don't know, I've noticed it in the last couple of years. Maybe they've done it for longer than that, but they're always talking about this guy. This guy does this and this guy does that. And I don't know, Jakob, every time you say this guy, I'm always having a little laugh inside, because it does make me laugh. Because, of course, this guy, they're talking about how things are moving through the system. But, for me, I really find it hard to shake this guy, because I'm a UX person, right? I'm always interested in this guy. And actually, I don't really care about this guy too much. I do at the minute, because I do, honestly, Jakob, it's my job at the moment. But normally, my natural state of mind is really to think about this particular guy. Have you noticed this, by the way? Look, these are all the same colour across. I cut and paste it from over here and put it over. You notice they're all different colours. That's a bit of an interesting optical illusion. No? Okay. So in terms of the way these things work, in terms of the perspective, I think if you're a UX person, I think it's fair to say that the rhythms that you work in, the cadence you work in, are often quite different to the team. The team might be working on a weekly cycle, and you're thinking often longer times, because you're working miles ahead, maybe. Or, you've definitely got a different rhythm inside. Certainly the size of the work, developers are always interested. I'm working on this particular thing here, and you're like, well, it's bigger than that. It's much bigger than that. It's the whole thing. Or you might be focused on a particular bit of work, and actually it's very difficult not to see this in a wider scope. And obviously, if the developers are working really well, they focus maybe on a sort of very limited, a sort of tightly defined concerns, where you might have a concern that are related to the business or all kinds of stuff like that. I think if you are looking at, in terms of almost like a ladder of abstraction, really, we've got story, journey, products, and service. And if you're good, you're going to be neckering throughout those things. You've got to be thinking about all of these things, not simultaneously, because you can't. But you have to be able to sort of change in that perspective, so you can move up and down these perspectives, I think. And I think that's what makes the UX role a bit messy, because obviously we talk about experience as if it actually means anything. I've got no idea. I mean, Don Norman came up with the idea of user experience, but it's just you might as well just call it a Boonschligel or something. It's pointless. It's almost a meaningless word, I think, in lots of ways. So I want to talk about, obviously this is some rare footage of DevOps days in Ghent 2009 as people entered the DevOps rapture there. I like this girl here, she's really into DevOps. And so for me then, obviously I have a very limited understanding of what DevOps is really. I'm not a DevOps person, but I work in DevOps environments, and there's lots of stuff that I've kind of absorbed by osmosis, which I think is really interesting. There's a website called DevOps Topologies, and the thing that interested me was that this particular quote here. This is the blah, 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 blah. You can read that. The idea is that if you're throwing stuff over the wall, you're basically claiming the credit before you should be. And if you think about the kind of history, the work history that people like me have, if you're a UX person, quite a lot of UX people start in agencies, and really, that's how agencies work. Agencies are really, really, sorry, that is great, that one, isn't it? Agencies really work. They're really happy just sort of delivering stuff over to a client. And really, they're not really, I'm going to change that one, it's distracting, isn't it? I'm not sure this one's any less distracting, though. Yeah. Oh, this one's bound to be less distracting, isn't it? Oh, no, it's another one. So when you, this one's less distracting. So like I say, when you're working in an agency, your business model really is you make something and you hand it over, and really you don't even hand it over most of the time. Often you deliver it as a zipped file, and there you go, client, you release it yourself, or maybe you've got it on some kind of staging environment and there's a button you press at the end. So my kind of transformation here came when I was working with a relatively, I can't say the name of it, but they're a company that's in London. And what I was doing was I was a producer for a website and a mobile app for disabled people. So they had a particular kind of disability as well. And it was an interesting thing for me because even though this particular website was designed specifically for disabled people, they spent most of the money on hand-painted backgrounds for the pages very, very early on. And we had very little money left to do the actual sort of, certainly didn't have any money to do any detailed accessibility work, for example. There were no nice disabled toilets on that particular website. And I had a weird, not a DevOps job, but 2 different roles there. So I was doing UX, but I was also the kind of producer, which meant I was responsible, the delivery manager really, responsible for delivering this kind of thing. So on one hand, I'm trying to get this in under budget. On the other hand, I'm trying to make this so it actually works for deaf people. So for deaf people can use this particular website. There's loads of audio there. Because obviously deaf people normally can use websites, it's not an issue. But, and this was my first time, because it was a big organisation, it was my first time working with a DevOps team. And we used to, in the agency, this is like 2009, and we really used to make fun of these people because we'd never encountered anybody like them before. They were constantly sort of saying, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that. And so we'd just sort of joke, DevOps says you can't do that. And one of the things they were obsessed with was this phrase of bootstrap from nothing. So right, we're working with an open source content management system. And anybody who's developed with an open source content management system, most of the stuff you do actually is kind of ticking boxes, right? You just go, do you want it to do that? So you check a box. And you have to do some coding, but not that much, in fact. And so the DevOps people would sort of say, well, how are you going to do that? And we'd say, well, we're going to install this plugin, because that plugin will do that. And they would say, no, you've got to bootstrap from nothing. And what they meant from bootstrap from nothing was you can't, if the site fails, you can't just sort of relaunch it again because it's going to take you 7 days to go around through the UI and click all of these boxes. So you have to do all this kind of stuff in code. And for us, this was just like laughable. This was just the biggest thing ever. Like, oh, why would you bother doing it all in code? Because it's an open source CMS with tick boxes. I think the interesting thing there for me was that we all complained about this. And I complained about it the most because I was in charge of the budget. But I do remember very, very clearly 4 months later. So we delivered that project on time. It was an unpleasant time. But I noticed we were doing a retro on another project. And everything that these people had told us to do, all of the devs had started doing. Every single thing that we built, we were bootstrapping from nothing. And I kind of probed this. I was like, hang on, you were complaining about this not that long ago, and now you're doing everything. Like, it feels like everything that you moaned about, now you're doing day in, day out. And nobody actually said this, but it became really clear that this was a bit like disabled toilets. It's not difficult, but it is hard. And so it was never a question of like they didn't have the talent or the skill to do this. They couldn't be asked, actually. But after a few failures, after a few problems, it became something that, I don't know, I noticed that they just took it on board. And it really made me sit up and listen because they were so loud and so much complaining about it. So that's me now. I am in this the DevOps rapture. So if you talk about DevOps topologies, I think topologies there is just a fancy word for saying how you organize your teams and how you organize your work as it goes through. It made me think about how you do this with kind of design stuff, because I'm not sure the way design is set up in many organizations is any healthier than the kind of pre-DevOps type stuff that you'd get. And I think one of the things that really hits home for me is that you can't really do all of this continuous integration stuff, continuous deployment stuff, unless you have tools. So you get a lot of people, particularly in agile world, who are always saying, it's not about the tools, it's about the people. Well, rubbish. Actually, that's completely not true. I mean, it is true a bit, but without all of these amazing smart tools, the ways that we can do automation, I'm not sure we'll be able to do half the stuff that we can do. And you don't really get those sets of tools, those tool chains in UX stuff. So very few design teams that I work with or go to visit actually have a kind of helicopter view of what their whole thing is. It's very hard sometimes to get a straight answer where their world starts and their world ends. And they certainly don't necessarily have this is a famous Lego service blueprint, like it's something that Lego produced, which lots of other companies have copied. It looks really childish and simple, but what it's doing is saying, if you go to Legoland, you're going to go through all of these stages here. And if we want to make that experience at Legoland good, we're going to have to optimize the whole thing. It's no good us having Legoland in northern Denmark if we can't make the journey from I don't know, Western France to Northern Denmark easily. Anyway, like I say, very few organizations have this kind of approach where they kind of produce a map of everything. Recently, you see a lot of sort of creative agencies and UX people talk about we're not delivering designs anymore, we're not delivering wireframes, but what we are going to deliver is design systems. So you get all of these kind of, I think they're reinventing the wheel stuff, to be honest, but for UX people, it's brand new. Like instead of us delivering a page, we're going to deliver all of the components for the page, and then we can do that kind of stuff. Now, I know we're on camera and stuff like that, but if you look at HMRC, for example, that's not how it works. At HMRC, most of the teams have got their own prototype. Many of the teams have got their own CSS. There's a bunch of stuff which really could and should be being reused, but it's not. And actually, it's much harder to get started and borrow stuff than it really feels like it needs to be. So my question here is, is there stuff that we can steal from slightly more technically literate people? And the answer is, for me, an obvious yes. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we could be doing that we're probably not doing. If we take an example of something like design, like if you join a new project in loads and loads of places, and you're after, why did we build this particular thing? What was the, did I say design? I meant research, actually, sorry. You ask a question. This happened just this week. We built this. Why did we build this? Where was the research behind it? And then somebody will send you a whole archive of Google documents. And they'll say that, well, the answer's in there somewhere, in those 3 or 4 presentations, and in these 26 emails, and these 50,000 documents. You wouldn't do that in a release thing, would you? You wouldn't release something and then have all the information not on the Jira ticket, for example. Why don't we do that in this kind of world? Because it seems like we've got the tools to do that, right? If you look at the sort of the history of design stuff, it's even that kind of simple stuff like version control feels very, very hard in designs. Often you get people who seemingly change a design probably at a whim, and you don't really know what the history of that is. And again, I reckon this is relatively easy to do. Otherwise, I'm not just shouting down the well here. Actually, we have the tools to do this. I don't think it needs any particularly new approaches to do that. So I guess, am I saying this is UX people's fault? No, obviously, I'm not saying that it's UX people's fault. But I am saying that probably we should probably, I don't know, force people to change, actually. We should help people develop new tools and processes to be able to make this kind of stuff work a little bit better. Perhaps there's a role for UX people to kind of maybe work at not just sort of delivering designs, but working on design systems. So looking at the way that designs are delivered within enterprises. I think most, if not all of, that's completely unfair. Many of the design approaches and techniques that you see in large enterprises, the kind of people we work with, I think originally have their origin in places like creative agencies, because that's where a lot of UX designers work. I'm sure there are some people who've only ever done enterprise UX, and I've met a few of them from places like Lloyds Bank, and I've met one person actually who maybe, I don't know, they had to sign out a wireframe because only one person could have a wireframe at the same time, and then they had to sign it back in at the end of the week. It was quite incredible. Obviously, that's a bit stupid, but really the cognitive overhead, like the ability to think about, remember that diagram of all the stuff that UX people do? Actually, to keep all that stuff in your head is incredibly hard. I'll use a particular example. I think UX people should be the people who probably care most in most teams about accessibility. In general, they don't, though. And the reason they don't is because it's hard. And they don't necessarily have the cognitive space to do that. And the front-end developer, for some random reason, is another team. And again, they don't really have the space to be able to take into consideration all that kind of stuff because they're just dealing with mess and nonsense, actually. So I think what I'm saying is that if we were to bring the approaches that we've got for managing all of that mess for releasing code and use the same approaches for managing design and managing design research, I think we'd do well. And not only that, I think we're the kind of people to do it. I don't see other places doing this. We're the kind of people who care about this stuff, and we're the kind of people who work in very large organizations. If it's going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from an environment like this, I would have thought. I never really know how to end talks, so here's a picture of a dog looking awkward because it's been caught pretending to be a human. So thank you. I think that really is my favourite GIF of all time. Yeah.
So did you discuss that with any other UX person at HMRC?
No, because I'm not in the UX community at HMRC. But no, I haven't. To be honest, it's something that I've been thinking about it a long time, but until recently it's been a bit whiny, to be honest, because I recognised it was a problem, but didn't necessarily begin to articulate any solutions. And there's nothing worse than somebody going, well, that's terrible, without being able to begin to offer some kind of solutions, I think.
Have you tried it?
Some of this stuff, yeah. So some of the approaches where you would kind of have a slightly more granular approach to user research, like actually if you're an information architect, having very small bits of user research that you can tie to stuff with tags and things, it's not hard. It is hard to keep up the habit, but to set it up in the first place, not hard. I think also the ability to do kind of audits and sort of genuinely go into a place and say, actually, this is the stuff that we've built, and we can break them down into these components. So that atomic design approach, that's something that we actually did at the Home Office. It was pretty partly successful, I think. It's really easy to kick these things off and go really enthusiastic. It's much harder to keep that up. And to be honest, that's what I'm suggesting, that talking about DevOps, it's not just the fact that you're managing two disciplines. I think you need somebody to keep you honest here. For me, this would be a product manager. Product managers are the ultimate neckerers. They should be neckering between all of these states. And one of the things that I think would be really useful is for people to start insisting on this kind of stuff. And I didn't say it, I meant to say actually, you go to development environments and you don't see developers choosing their own language. In most of our projects, you don't really see them even choosing their own IDE, do you? They're all, at HMRC, everybody is using IntelliJ, they're all using Scala, there's a pretty much defined tool chain. Whereas the UX designers I interview are all saying, well, I prefer Axure, or I prefer this. Who cares? Actually, who cares? It's great that people have autonomy, but actually we should be able to leverage a sort of common tool chain as well. I think that's critical. If you can't have a common tool chain where it matters, then you're never going to succeed. And so a lot of my colleagues, they won't learn to code, for example. They won't learn to, and it's not, again, that's not hard, is it? Particularly if you're pairing with sort of, let's say, front-end developers and you can sort of set up a style guide. It's not that hard, but people won't do it. So we get, a balsamic wireframe attached to a Jira story which hasn't got the content up to date. It's trivial stuff, actually.
Like UX people, user researchers, etc., use quite a lot of paper also. So you've got stuff like research walls and you have post-its all over the place.
Yeah.
Sometimes one of the challenges might be, how do you marry the two and make it, because then the question is, do we have time to keep on top of everything?
It's funny because I had that picture of Dana Scully saying, I don't care, in there, kind of trying to indicate that really there should be no sacred cows here. But actually, now I'm feeling like, no, don't take my paper away. I really want my paper. I don't know. I haven't got a good answer for that one.
Maybe it's the other way around. So the project we're running at the moment, we're not using any electronic tools to manage it. So our user stories are index cards, paperclip to some wireframes that we've sketched up with a Sharpie on some paper that sit under our whiteboard. So it's kind of the other
It's more organizing whether it's digital or paper, isn't
That's
it?
We made a decision as a team to do it that way.
Presumably, you're the only team in that building, though. There aren't other teams committing to the same code base.
That's true for the next week.
Okay. I'm looking forward to seeing all these pull requests come in by paper, but how's it working? Actually, that's what Kanban means, right? It is a card that you take to another team. But
For me, the thing that jumped out of this, and it's something I've seen again and again, is it's that UX person on the team, and generally there is one UX person on a team where a team is 8 people or something, having to have the 3-month out, 6-month out, year out view, but also in that product ownership responsibility of? How do they divide that up so they can give a wireframe to go with the story for the next sprint and have it detailed and have an interaction design around it? That for me has always felt like a thing where there isn't enough space in somebody's head to do all of that.
I think there's something there is a degree of preciousness though, that you often get. You get people who say, "Who will care about the user if it's not me?" And I think I misheard this on a podcast. I looked at my notes yesterday. I was going to include it, but I think I got my notes wrong. But I think there's a concept of something called delivered security. So the idea of delivered security is that you might force people to have a 50 character password, but you're not actually delivering any security because nobody's going to use it. And I think for me, there's a similar concept with delivered usability as well. Like often particularly when we're working on brownfield or legacy stuff, people get really hung up on little details. But actually maybe we should have more of a focus on getting rid of all the crap first. And maybe having something that's not terrible maybe is good enough. Yeah. And then you can start building on top of that. So.
One thing that would be really good, talking about innovation ideas and equal experts. This probably happens already, I don't know, I've been here for 3 months, but having like an interest group, having sort of like special interest groups, like you raised really important questions here today. If there's any way we could get together a number of people who are interested in actually chatting about it, as and when we have time, because we all know it's very pretty to say, hey, let's think about this, and then, we don't have the time. But, maybe worth the effort and trying to set up something, somewhere, somehow.
Okay.
This is the way I see stuff. I see stuff based on proof, experiments, right? So at the moment, it's more about, I think we can do it this way, but it should really be about, okay, let's get a base case here, and let's get people to try it this way, and then we can decide, okay, is this the right way to go, or is this not the right way to go? So,
yeah.
We need the randomized trial.
Yeah.
Sorry to be a pain.
No, it's...
Any more? Anyone?
That means don't ask any more questions.
Yeah. We're not running over, guys, so we're not going to have a break. And if you want to grab a drink, if you want one, and head straight upstairs, that'd be great. We've got the competition next.
Thank you. That was much less nerve-wracking than I thought it would be.